All right, guys, we've just finished up talking about Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Act of 1964, passed by Lyndon B. Johnson after the assassination of JFK in Dallas, Texas, and we pick up with some new successes and challenges during the Civil Rights Movement. There were many that were frustrated with Martin Luther King's nonviolent approach, nonviolent methods, and felt that more needed to be done to remove what they saw as oppression by a white-dominated society. And one of those gentlemen was Malcolm X, who you see here on the screen. These people believed that the court decisions, like the Brown versus Board of Education, and even the passing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, didn't go far enough, that it didn't fundamentally affect the African Americans' right to vote, and ultimately it didn't change the hearts and minds of many white Southerners throughout the southeastern part of the United States. And that is where some of this violence comes into play, believing that not enough has been done. What we want. Integration has been based on complete acceptance of the fact that in order to have a decent house or education, blacks must move into a white neighborhood or send their children to a white school. This reinforces the notion that white is automatically better and black is by definition inferior. So in the summer of 1964, the SNCC will enlist about 1,000 volunteers to help African Americans in the South register to vote. They'd spent several years campaigning for the right to vote, and just give you an example, in Mississippi, in the state of Mississippi, not one single African American was registered to vote in 1964. Now, mainly those that were assisting in this movement were students, just like we've seen with the sit-ins and the freedom rides and everything. And before most of the volunteers arrived, there were 3 civil rights workers that disappeared. And the SNCC claimed that they were murdered. The state obviously denied those charges. President Johnson ordered a search to just figure out where these 3 civil rights workers had gone, and it was later discovered that all 3 of them had been shot at point-blank range and then buried on the side of the road. So that kind of kicks off what becomes known as Freedom Summer, which was an effort in Mississippi to try to push for more and more African Americans getting involved in the ability to vote. On March 7th, 1965, Martin Luther King Jr. is going to organize a march on Selma, which is in Alabama, in order to pressure Congress to pass more inclusive voting right laws in the United States. There's a movie that just came out recently about Selma. Once again, these are nonviolent marchers, just like we've seen in these other protest movements led by Martin Luther King Jr., and they were met with a violent response once again. And Americans become outraged by the treatment that they see on national television of African Americans who are simply peacefully protesting for equality in our society. And because of the brawl that ensues and the treatment of African Americans during this March of Selma, March 7th, 1965 becomes known as Bloody Sunday. Now, historically, voting rights had been a state issue, but President Johnson was ready to finally make it a federal issue because of the lack of equality between whites and blacks. So President Johnson is going to personally go on national television and call for a voting rights law, in addition to the Civil Rights Act that he had already gotten previously passed back in 1964. Here's an image of the march on Selma. You can see here front and center in the middle with the hat on, that is Martin Luther King Jr., who was one of the leaders of that march. So in 1965, LBJ successfully gets the Voting Rights Act passed. It'll ban literacy tests, which, remember, we looked at one in class and kind of the ridiculous questions that they expected you to have the ability to answer. And it will give the federal government the power to oversee voter registration and elections within states that discriminated against minorities. So these particular measures of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 are targeting southern states, the southeastern part of the United States. And you can see in this chart here on the left, or on the right-hand side, the African American voter registration from 1964 to 1968, and the drastic increases in numbers. For example, at the state of Alabama, from 23% all the way up to 56%. So drastic increases in the amount of people that are registered to vote. Now, President Johnson at the same time called for a amendment added to the Constitution, and that will become known as the 24th Amendment, which will officially ban poll taxes. Remember, that was where you had to pay a certain amount for the ability to vote, which primarily white people could afford, African Americans could not. And at the same time, the Supreme Court decisions were handed down that limited racial gerrymandering, which is the practice of drawing election districts in such a way as to dilute the African American vote. So it eliminates that under a court case called Baker versus Carr, and it establishes this principle that one person equals one vote, and there's not going to be any kind of shimmying of votes and any type of corruption when it comes to voting, voting rights and voting abilities. Now, the Voting Rights Act obviously is not going to be something every single person is on board with, but it will lead to a growing African American participation in politics. For example, by 1984, roughly 70% of African Americans were registered to vote on average across the United States. Discrimination and poverty continued to plague northern urban centers, and simmering anger exploded into violence in the summer of 1967. And you can see here at the bottom where some of those issues actually take place in Watts. Watts was a predominantly African American neighborhood in Los Angeles, and the disputes that break out in the summer of 1967 there will result in 43 deaths and roughly $50 million in property damages. Newark, New Jersey, and Detroit, Michigan also saw a variety of violent scenes that break out. Previously, whites had used violence to keep blacks in their place, so to speak, with the KKK and all that. But now blacks were using violence against police and white businesses to retaliate against the treatment that they faced during and before the Civil Rights Act. So it's at this time that President Johnson decides to put together a group of politicians to determine what the cause of the riots were. It's called the Kerner Commission. And your mind is going to be blown by what they come away with, and that's the fact that long-term racial discrimination was the cause of violence. So the fact that white people continued to discriminate against African Americans was making them angry. I don't know why we needed a commission to come to a conclusion such as that, but the commission will propose that federal money is spent on programs aimed at overcoming the problems of the ghetto, the problems that African Americans face by being stuck in a vicious cycle of poverty. And there were plenty of people that disagreed with that. Many argued against the use of federal money because it would reward the rioters that were being seen across the United States. And in the end, little money was even spent on it because we were busy spending money on the Vietnam War, which we'll get more into later. So the commission was put together to solve the problem, and then we didn't solve the problem because we didn't want to spend any money on the ultimate issue, and that was poverty amongst the African American community. So you have people that finally say enough is enough. Malcolm X is one of those. He was born as Malcolm Little in Omaha, Nebraska in 1925. He decided to adopt the X as to signify his lost African name. and Malcolm X argued that Little was his slave name and not his actual name. So that is why he is now known as Malcolm X. He did have a rather difficult childhood. As a young boy, he moved from Boston to New York City. He got mixed up with drugs and gangs, and by the time he was 21 years old, he was already in prison. While he was in prison, though, he made a drastic life decision to convert to Islam. And once he gets out of prison, he actually becomes a leader of the Nation of Islam. He becomes a minister. And he is calling African Americans to just break away from white society. The fact that he was an African American member of the Islam religion, kind of preaches this separation of races, so to speak. And so that kind of becomes the basis for what he's striving for as the mid-1960s kind of rolls through. Unfortunately, the violence that he's kind of associated with Malcolm X will lead eventually to his assassination in 1965, and ironically, he is assassinated by members of the Nation of Islam, the very people that he was supposed to be a leader for. Malcolm X was also associated with the Black Panthers, which we'll get to here in just a second. Extremely famous quote by Malcolm X: "Nobody can give you freedom, nobody can give you equality or justice or anything. If you're a man, you take it." And that kind of supports his claim of utilizing violence to some extent to get what he was trying to achieve in the civil rights movement. So the Black Panthers were a militant group organized to protect blacks from police abuse. The idea of quote-unquote black power led to fear in white people because they thought that it meant black violence. This movement, the Black Panthers, appealed to many African Americans. This is when you start to see a lot of African Americans have afros, and they're referring to themselves as black instead of a Negro or a colored person, to symbolize their belief that they were a powerful community that had the ability and right to stand up for what they believed in. The Black Panthers, as you can see, became a symbol of young militant African Americans, created anti-poverty programs, and protested attempts to restrict their right to bear arms. There were a lot of laws restricting African Americans from bearing arms. For example, there were a group of African Americans that walked into the Capitol building wearing big jackets and holding shotguns as an attempt to protest the restrictions placed on them. Here is a picture of Black Power, the fist raised high in the arm, arm raised high with the fist clenched. So Martin Luther King Jr. Clearly understood the the anger of the Black Panthers and Malcolm X, but he was still an advocate of nonviolence, thanks to his beliefs in kind of what was called the Gandhi way. He disagreed with the use of violence and the concept of black power, even though he understood where their anger was coming from. He spent a lot of time amongst the people of Chicago. He spent a year, actually, in the slums of Chicago while he created this Poor People's Campaign to persuade the nation to do more to help the poor. And then he traveled to Memphis, Tennessee in 1968 to promote his cause and lend support to striking sanitation workers. And it was on April 2nd that King addressed his followers after being asked a question about threats made on his life. MLK says, "Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will." The following day, while King stood on the balcony of his motel room outside of Memphis, Tennessee, he was struck by a shot from a high-powered rifle. He died at the hospital shortly thereafter at the age of 39. There is the image. Martin Luther King.